The cafeteria fell silent as Madison Turner opened her lunchbox to find her carefully prepared sandwich frozen solid, ice crystals coating the apple slices her grandmother had cut just that morning. 3 figures loomed over her table, their shadows blocking the fluorescent lights above. What happened next would change everything at Riverside High School and prove that sometimes the quietest students pack the most surprising punches. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Madison Turner had always been invisible at Riverside High School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. At 17, she possessed the rare ability to blend into any crowd, her honey brown hair falling like a curtain across her face whenever anyone looked her way. She preferred the back corners of classrooms, the middle seats in assemblies, and the quietest table in the cafeteria, table 14, tucked behind the vending machines where most students forgot it existed. Her grandmother, Elena Vasquez, had raised Madison since she was 8 years old. Elena worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment above the local bakery, Martinez Family Breads, where the scent of fresh conchas and tres leches cake drifted through their windows each morning. Elena had immigrated from Salvador, Brazil, bringing with her a fierce love for her heritage and an even fiercer determination to give Madison every opportunity she'd never had. "Mia, you carry strength in your bones," Elena would tell Madison. During their quiet evenings together, her weathered hands braiding Madison's hair before bed. "Your grandfather, he was a fighter. Not with anger, but with grace, like the wind that bends the trees but never breaks them." Madison never quite understood what her grandmother meant. She felt anything but strong, especially during lunch periods. When she watched other students laugh loudly, argue passionately, or simply exist without constantly checking over their shoulders. She ate her carefully packed lunches in silence, usually consisting of Elena's homemade empanadas, fresh fruit, and a thermos of café con leche that reminded her of home. The routine had become Madison's sanctuary. She'd arrive at table 14 at exactly 11:47 a.m., just as the first wave of students finished getting their food. She'd spread her lunch methodically, napkin first, then the containers in order of when she'd eat them. She'd pull out her worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude and read while eating, letting Garcia Marquez's magical realism transport her away from the harsh fluorescent reality of the cafeteria. That her only real friend was Jamie Chun, a fellow junior who shared her love of books and quiet spaces. Jamie had moved to Cedar Rapids from San Francisco the previous year, and they'd bonded over being outsiders, Jamie as the new kid, Madison as the perpetually overlooked one. They'd found each other in the library during a particularly brutal October day when the popular kids had decided to make fun of Madison's thrift store sweater. "You know what I like about you?" Jamie had said that day, settling into the chair across from Madison in the library's poetry section. "You don't pretend to be someone you're not. That's rare." Madison had looked up from her homework, surprised. "Most people think I'm boring." "Most people are idiots," Jamie had replied with a grin. "Besides, I bet you're not as quiet as everyone thinks you are. You just haven't found your voice yet." Jamie was right about more than she knew. Madison carried secrets that would have surprised her classmates. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she walked to the community center downtown, where Elena had enrolled her in a Capoeira class 3 years ago. Master Roberto Santos, a 60-year-old Brazilian man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold entire stories, had taken one look at Madison's shy demeanor and seen something others missed. "Capoeira is not just fighting," he'd explained. During her first lesson, "It's a conversation, it's music. It's the story of people who found freedom in movement when everything else was taken from them." Madison had initially resisted. She'd wanted to take art classes or join the debate team, anything that would keep her in the background. But Elena had insisted, and Madison had discovered something extraordinary. when the berimbau played and the rota formed when she moved. To the rhythm of the atabaque and pandero, she felt like someone entirely different. Her body knew things her mind couldn't explain. Her legs could sweep and her arms could flow in ways that felt ancient, inherited, powerful. But that was in the safe space of the community center, surrounded by Master Roberto's gentle guidance and the encouraging voices of the other students. At school, Madison remained the girl who apologized for taking up space, who never raised her hand even when she knew the answer, who blushed when teachers called on her. The contrast between her two worlds created a constant tension. At home and at Capoeira, Elena and Master Roberto saw glimpses of fire in Madison's dark eyes. At school, she remained a shadow, moving through hallways like she was afraid of being noticed. Her academic performance reflected this duality. Madison excelled in written assignments, her essays earning consistent A's in English and history. But participation grades pulled her down. She'd rather fail a class than speak up in front of her peers. The few times teachers had forced her to present, she'd stood at the front of the room with her voice barely above a whisper, her hands shaking as she rushed through her words. The bullying had started small, as it always does. Jessica Martinez, ironically sharing a surname with the bakery below Madison's apartment, had noticed Madison's quiet nature during their shared algebra class. Jessica, with her platinum blonde hair and perfectly applied makeup, ruled the junior class with an iron fist wrapped in designer clothing. Her followers, Ashley Peterson and Brittany Johnson, flanked her like bodyguards, ready to laugh at her jokes and echo her opinions. It began with subtle things. Jessica would accidentally bump into Madison in the hallways, then laugh when Madison mumbled an apology. Ashley would make comments about Madison's clothes just loud enough for nearby students to hear. Brittany would save seats with her backpack, then claim they were taken when Madison approached. Madison had learned to navigate around these small cruelties, adjusting her routes and timing to avoid confrontation. She'd never told Elena about the bullying, not wanting to add to her grandmother's already heavy burden. Elena worked 16-hour days between her cleaning job at the hospital and her evening shift at the hotel. The last thing Madison wanted was to give her grandmother something else to worry about. The escalation had been gradual. Jessica had discovered that Madison never fought back, never reported anything, never even looked her in the eye during these encounters. This silence, which Madison intended as protection, had instead painted a target on her back. Jessica interpreted it as weakness, and weakness was something she couldn't resist exploiting. By November, the harassment had moved beyond hallway encounters. Jessica had begun making comments about Madison's heritage, mimicking what she claimed was a Mexican accent, despite Madison's family being Brazilian. She'd started calling Madison "Invisible Girl" in front of other students, always with a sweet smile that made it sound almost like a compliment. Madison's grades had begun to suffer. She'd started skipping classes where she'd have to interact with Jessica's group, preferring to hide in the library or nurse's office. Even her beloved lunch period had become a source of anxiety. She'd catch Jessica staring at her from across the cafeteria, whispering to her friends while pointing in Madison's direction. The only place Madison felt truly safe was at Capoeira. During their Thursday evening class, Master Roberto had noticed her distraction. "Your ginga is off today, Madison," he'd said, using the term for the basic Capoeira movement. "Your body is here, but your spirit is somewhere else." Madison had looked around the road at the other students who'd become like family to her. Marcus Williams, a college student who'd been practicing for 5 years. Sarah Kim, a middle-aged teacher who'd started Capoeira after her divorce. Miguel Rodriguez, a teenager like herself who'd found Capoeira after getting out of trouble with gangs. "I'm fine, mister," Madison had replied, using the Portuguese title of respect, but Master Roberto had seen through her deflection. After class, he'd approached her with the wisdom that came from decades of teaching young people. The ancestors who created capoeira faced much worse than whatever troubles you, he'd said gently. They were enslaved, beaten, sold like property. But they found strength in movement, in music, in community. They disguised their fighting as dancing so their oppressors wouldn't recognize the power they were building. Madison had nodded, but the connection between her ancestors' struggles and her own high school problems felt too vast to bridge. Capoeira teaches us that every challenge is a conversation, Master Roberto had continued. Sometimes we dodge, sometimes we attack, sometimes we flow. But we never, ever stand still and let someone hurt us. Those words had echoed in Madison's mind as she'd walked home that night, past the familiar storefronts and streetlights of her neighborhood. She'd climbed the narrow stairs to their apartment, where Alina was waiting with a plate of leftover pastries from the bakery and questions about her day. "How was school, Mia?" Elena had asked, as she did every evening. "Fine," Madison had replied, as she did every evening, the lie sitting heavy in her stomach. But as she'd lain in bed that night, listening to Elena's gentle snoring through the thin walls, Madison had felt something stirring, a restlessness that hadn't been there before. Master Roberto's words mixed with the rhythm of capoeira songs in her head, creating a drumbeat that seemed to say, "Something has to change." She'd had no idea that change would come so dramatically, or that it would begin with a frozen lunch that would alter the entire trajectory of her senior year. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in early December, when the Iowa winter had settled over Cedar Rapids with the kind of bitter cold that made everyone hurry. Between buildings with their heads down and shoulders hunched, Madison arrived at table 14 precisely on schedule, her lunch bag clutched against her chest like armor. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual chaos, the cheerleaders discussing weekend plans, the theater kids rehearsing lines between bites, the athletes comparing protein shakes. Madison had become expert at filtering out the noise, creating her own bubble of silence in the storm of teenage social dynamics. She went through her familiar ritual: napkin, containers arranged in eating order, book propped against her water bottle. Today's lunch was particularly special. Elena had made her favorite Venezuelan arepas filled with black beans and cheese, along with fresh mango slices and a small container of Elena's homemade hot chocolate in her thermos. The arepas were still warm from the morning preparation, wrapped carefully in aluminum foil. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Madison had just opened her copy of Like Water for Chocolate when a shadow fell across her table. She looked up to find Jessica Martinez standing directly in front of her, flanked by Ashley and Brittany. But something was different today. Jessica's usual smirk had been replaced by something harder, more predatory. Well, Jessica said, her voice carrying across the nearby tables. "Look what we have here." Little invisible girl, eating her weird foreign food again. Madison's stomach clenched. Other students at nearby tables had started to notice the confrontation, turning in their seats to watch. She felt heat rise to her cheeks as she became the center of attention she'd spent years avoiding. "That's not ... Madison started to protest, her voice barely audible. "What was that?" Jessica leaned closer, cupping her ear dramatically. "I can't hear you. Do you even speak English, or just whatever language they speak in Taco Bell?" Ashley and Brittany laughed on cue, the sound sharp and cutting. Madison felt something twist inside her chest, not just embarrassment now, but a spark of anger. Elena's heritage wasn't something to be mocked. The hours her grandmother spent perfecting recipes from her homeland, the stories she told about growing up in Salvador, the pride she took in sharing her culture through food, none of that deserved this treatment. "She's Brazilian," Madison said, louder this time, though her voice still shook. "Oh, Brazilian." Jessica clapped her hands together mockingly. That explains the weird smell coming from your lunch every day. Don't you have any normal food? Like, I don't know, sandwiches, pizza? Food that actual Americans eat? The comment hit Madison like a physical blow. She'd heard variations of this her entire life, the suggestion that she and Elena weren't real Americans, that their culture was somehow less valid than others. But hearing it said so publicly, with an audience of her peers watching and some of them starting to laugh, made her feel small and exposed in a way she'd never experienced. "My grandmother makes the best food," Madison said, surprising herself, with the steadiness in her voice. "And we are Americans." "Your grandmother?" Jessica's eyes lit up with malicious delight. "Oh, this is even better. You're probably here illegally, aren't you? Living off welfare, taking jobs from real Americans?" The accusations were absurd. Elena had become a citizen 15 years ago, worked 2 jobs, and had never accepted government assistance in her life. But Madison could see some of the watching students nodding along, their faces reflecting the ugly prejudices Jessica was voicing. "That's not true," Madison said, but her voice had returned to its usual whisper. "What? Speak up, or are you afraid immigration will hear you?" Jessica reached across the table and grabbed Madison's lunch bag. Before she could react, "Let's see what kind of weird stuff you brought today." "Don't touch that." Madison stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The sound echoed through the suddenly quiet cafeteria. Jessica pulled out the foil-wrapped arepas, holding them up like evidence in a trial. "What even is this? It looks like someone already chewed it and spit it back up." The mockery of Elena's cooking food, made with love and pride and generations of tradition, finally broke something inside Madison. She lunged forward to grab her lunch back, but Jessica was ready for her. "Oh, you want it back?" Jessica said with false sweetness. "Here, let me help you cool down that attitude." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Jessica opened Madison's thermos of hot chocolate and poured it over the arepas, then pulled out a small container from her own lunch bag, an ice pack designed to keep drinks cold. But instead of ice, it was filled with some kind of freezing gel that Jessica began squeezing all over Madison's food. "There," Jessica announced to the watching crowd. "Now your gross food matches your cold personality." The arepas, moments before warm and comforting, were now a soggy, freezing mess. The mango slices were covered in the chemical gel. Even Madison's book had droplets of the freezing mixture on its pages. The smell of the gel, sharp and artificial, replaced the warm, comforting aroma of Elena's cooking. Madison stared at the destruction of her carefully prepared lunch, and something fundamental shifted inside her. This wasn't just about cafeteria bullying anymore. This was about Elena waking up at 5 in the morning to prepare food with love. This was about their heritage being treated like garbage. This was about being told she didn't belong in the country where she was born. "You're going to clean this up," Madison said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone, including herself. Jessica laughed, but there was something nervous in it now. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "I said you're going to clean this up." Madison's voice grew stronger with each word. "And you're going to apologize." The cafeteria had gone completely silent now. Even the lunch ladies had stopped serving to watch the confrontation. Madison could feel hundreds of eyes on her, but for the first time in her life, she didn't want to disappear. Or what? Jessica stepped closer, invading Madison's personal space. "What are you going to do about it, invisible girl? Cry? Run to your illegal grandmother?" That final insult broke the last thread holding Madison back. Without thinking, without planning, she stepped into a jinga, the basic capoeira stance that had become as natural to her as breathing. Her feet found the rhythm Master Roberto had drilled into her, her body swaying with the memory of countless Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Jessica noticed the change immediately. Madison's posture had transformed from hunched and defensive to fluid and grounded. Her eyes, usually downcast, now met Jessica's directly with an intensity that made the popular girl take an involuntary step backward. "What are you doing?" Jessica demanded, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Madison didn't answer. She was remembering Master Roberto's words about capoeira being a conversation. Right now her body was asking Jessica a question. "Are you ready for what comes next?" The silence in the cafeteria stretched taut like a wire about to snap. Students who had been eating, laughing, and gossiping moments before now watched with the fascination of witnesses to something unprecedented. Madison Turner quiet. Invisible Madison Turner was standing her ground. Ashley and Brittany flanked Jessica again, but they looked uncertain. This wasn't following their usual script. Their victims were supposed to cower, maybe cry, possibly run away. They weren't supposed to transform into something that looked dangerous. "You're insane," Jessica said, but she took another step back. "Are you having some kind of breakdown?" Madison felt the rhythm of capoeira music in her head, the call and response of the berimbau and atabaque. Her grandmother's stories about her grandfather, the fighter who moved like wind, suddenly made perfect sense. Master Roberto's lessons about strength disguised as grace, about finding power in movement, crystallized into clarity. She wasn't invisible. She had never been invisible. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to be seen. The freezing. Gel continued to drip from her ruined lunch onto the cafeteria floor, each drop a reminder of the line that had been crossed. Madison looked at the mess, then back at Jessica, and made a decision that would change everything. "This ends now," she said, her voice carrying across the silent cafeteria like a promise. Jamie Chun, who had been eating lunch at a table across the room, stood up slowly. Several other students followed suit, as if they sensed that something significant was about to happen. The normal rhythm of the lunch period had been completely disrupted, replaced by an electric tension that made everyone hold their breath. Jessica looked around at the watching faces, realizing that she had pushed this confrontation further than intended. But backing down now, in front of the entire cafeteria, would damage her carefully constructed social hierarchy. She had to maintain her position as the untouchable queen of Riverside High. "Fine," Jessica said, forcing her voice back to its usual cruel confidence. "You want to do this here? In front of everyone? Perfect. Let's see what happens when the invisible girl tries to become visible." Madison felt her body settle deeper into the jingda, her weight distributed perfectly between her feet. 3 years of capoeira training had prepared her for this moment, even if she hadn't realized it. Every class where Master Roberto had taught them about respect and dignity, every song about fighting for freedom, every movement that connected her to generations of resilient ancestors, it all led to this cafeteria, this moment, this choice. The frozen lunch between them had become more than spilled food. It was a declaration of war. And Madison Turner, for the first time in her 17 years, was ready to fight back. The standoff in the cafeteria lasted exactly 12 seconds before Principal Morrison's voice boomed across the room. "What's going on here?" Dr. Rebecca Morrison had been principal at Riverside High for 8 years, and she had developed an uncanny ability to appear wherever trouble was brewing. Her heels clicked against the linoleum as she approached table 14, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. Madison in her strange fighting stance, Jessica backing away with her friends, the mess of frozen food on the floor, and 200 students watching in complete silence. "Nothing, Dr. Morrison," Jessica said quickly, her voice returning to its usual sweet tone. "Madison just had a little accident with her lunch. We were trying to help her clean it up." Madison felt the moment slipping away like water through her fingers. The principal's arrival had broken the spell, and she could see Jessica already spinning the narrative in her favor. The injustice of it made her chest tight with frustration. "Madison?" Dr. Morrison looked at her expectantly. "Is that what happened?" Madison opened her mouth, then closed it again. 3 years of staying silent, of avoiding confrontation, of making herself invisible, couldn't be overcome in a single moment of anger. The words she needed, the truth about what had really happened, stuck in her throat like stones. "She spilled her lunch," Madison said finally, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. Dr. Morrison studied both girls with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every possible teenage drama. Something wasn't right about this situation, but without more information, her hands were tied. "Well, let's get this cleaned up then," she said. "Jessica, Ashley, Brittany, you can help Madison since you were involved. The rest of you, back to your lunches, show's over." The cafeteria slowly returned to its normal buzz of conversation, but Madison could feel eyes on her from every direction. Some students looked disappointed that the confrontation had fizzled out. Others seemed relieved. A few, including Jamie, watched her with new interest, as if seeing her for the first time. Jessica bent down to pick up pieces of the ruined arepas, her movements slow and deliberate. When she was close enough that only Madison could hear, she whispered, "This isn't over, freak. You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." Madison spent the rest of the school day in a haze of anxiety and regret. Teachers' voices faded into background noise as she replayed the cafeteria scene in her mind, analyzing every moment, every word, every opportunity she'd missed to stand up for herself properly. The frozen gel had left sticky residue on her hands that she couldn't quite wash off, a constant reminder of her failure to defend Elena's cooking and their heritage. By the time the final bell rang, Madison's stomach was churning with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had Capoeira class that evening, and she needed Master Roberto's guidance more than ever. But first, she had to face Elena. The walk home took her through downtown Cedar Rapids, past the familiar storefronts and bus stops that had framed her childhood. The December air bit at her cheeks, but she barely noticed the cold. Her mind was spinning with questions. Should she tell Elena what had happened? Should she report Jessica to the administration? Should she try to handle this herself? Elena was waiting in their small kitchen when Madison climbed the stairs, flour dusting her apron and the warm smell of fresh bread filling the apartment. It was Tuesday, which meant Elena had spent her afternoon preparing for Wednesday's early morning baking shift. "Mia, you're late," Elena said, looking up from the dough she was kneading. "How was school?" Madison dropped her backpack by the door and tried to arrange her face into a neutral expression. "Fine, just stayed late to work on a project." But Elena had raised Madison for 9 years, and she could read her granddaughter's moods like changes in the weather. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face Madison fully. "What happened?" The simple question, asked with such gentle concern, nearly broke Madison's resolve to keep the incident secret. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and had to look away. "Nothing happened. I'm just tired." Elena studied her for a long moment, then reached into the refrigerator and pulled out a container of leftover sancocho, the hearty stew that had been Madison's comfort food since childhood. "Sit," Elena commanded, pointing to the small table by the window. "Eat, then tell me what's wrong." Madison wanted to protest, to insist that everything was fine, but the smell of the stew and the warmth in Elena's voice made her defenses crumble. She sat down and accepted the bowl Elena placed in front of her, along with a piece of warm bread that was still slightly too hot to touch. "Someone at school, ... Madison began, then stopped. How could she explain the complexity of what had happened? The cultural mockery, the frozen lunch, the moment when she'd almost fought back but hadn't? Someone at school, what? Elena prompted gently. "Someone said mean things about your cooking." "About us." Madison kept her eyes on the stew, watching steam rise from the surface. "They said we weren't real Americans." Elena's hands stilled on the dish towel she'd been folding. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Madison look up. "Mia, let me tell you something about being American." Elena sat down across from Madison, her weathered hands flat on the table. "Your grandfather and we came here with nothing but hope and strong backs. We worked jobs that others wouldn't take. We learned English at night school during working days. We paid taxes, we followed laws, we built a life." Madison had heard pieces of this story before, but never with the intensity Elena brought to it. Now, but most importantly, Elena continued, "we never let anyone make us ashamed of who we were. Brazilian food, Brazilian music, Brazilian joy, these things made us stronger Americans, not weaker ones. Anyone who tells you differently is speaking from fear, not truth." Madison felt something shift inside her chest, like a locked door finally opening. "But what do I do when they say those things, when they ... hurt the food you made?" Elena's eyes flashed with something fierce. "You remember that you carry the strength of generations in your blood. You remember that your capoeira teacher sees something in you that maybe you don't see yet. And you never, ever let anyone disrespect the love that goes into a meal." That evening, Madison arrived at the community center early, before any of the other students. Master Roberto was setting up the instruments for class, arranging the berimbau, atabaque, and pandero in their traditional positions around the road. "You're early tonight," he observed, looking up from tuning the berimbau's wire. "Something on your mind?" Madison had planned to ease into the conversation, to maybe mention the cafeteria incident casually. Instead, the whole story came tumbling out. Jessica's harassment, the frozen lunch, the moment when she'd stepped into Jenga formation, and her failure to follow through. Master Roberto listened without interruption, his calloused hands continuing to adjust the berimbau's tension while Madison spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "when enslaved Africans in Brazil created capoeira, they couldn't practice openly. Their masters would punish them for fighting. So they disguised their training as dance, as celebration. They learned to hide their strength until the moment it was needed." Madison nodded. She'd heard this history before, but tonight it felt different, more personal. "But here's what many people don't understand," Master Roberto continued. "The hiding wasn't the weakness. The hiding was a strategy. They were building power in secret, preparing for the day when they could use it." He stood up and moved to the center of the space where the rods would form. "Show me your Jenga." Madison stepped into the basic movement, her body finding the familiar rhythm, but something was different tonight. The frustration and anger from the cafeteria had changed her Jenga, made it sharper, more focused. "Good," Master Roberto said. "Now, what did you feel in that cafeteria when you stepped into this position?" "Angry," Madison said without hesitation. "Strong, like I could do something instead of just standing there." "And what stopped you?" Madison's finger faltered slightly. I was scared. Scared of what would happen if I actually fought back. Scared of getting in trouble. Scared of making things worse." Master Roberto nodded understandingly. "Fear is natural. But fear can be a teacher too. What did your fear teach you today?" Madison thought about it as she continued the Jenga. "That I'm not ready, that I need to be stronger, smarter. That I can't just react with anger." "Exactly. Capoeira isn't about winning fights in cafeterias. It's about developing the confidence to handle any situation with grace and power. But first, you have to believe you deserve to take up space in this world." As the other students began arriving for class, Madison felt something settling into place inside her. The confrontation with Jessica had been a failure, but it had also been a beginning. For the first time in her life, she'd stood her ground. Even if only for a moment. Marcus Williams arrived next, followed by Sarah Kim and Miguel Rodriguez. They formed the road as they always did, but tonight Madison felt different about her place in the circle. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was preparing. When Master Roberto began playing the berimbau and the other instruments joined in, Madison felt the familiar rhythm in her bones. But underneath the music, she heard something new. A drumbeat that sounded like determination, like courage building brick by brick. The games that night were more intense than usual. Madison found herself pushing harder, moving with more intention. When Miguel threw a fast Mealua kick that she'd normally dodge awkwardly, she instead flowed under it with a graceful esquiva, then countered with her own attack. "Better," Master Roberto called out during her game with Sarah. "Much better. You're starting to trust your body." After class, as Madison was rolling up the mats, Master Roberto approached her with a small piece of paper. "There's a capoeira workshop this Saturday at the university," he said. "Students from 3 different schools will be there. It might be good for you to see how other people handle challenges." Madison looked at the paper, which had details about a weekend workshop led by a visiting master from Chicago. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that." "Ready is a choice, not a feeling," Master Roberto replied. "Besides, sometimes we need to see ourselves through other people's eyes to understand our own strength." That night Madison lay in bed listening to Elena's gentle snoring through the thin walls. The events of the day played through her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. The cafeteria confrontation, Elena's words about strength and heritage, Master Roberto's lesson about hidden power building in secret. Tomorrow she will have to face Jessica again. Tomorrow there would probably be whispers and stares and maybe even retaliation for the scene she'd caused. But for the first time since the bullying began, Madison didn't feel helpless. She had a choice to make: continue hiding her strength, or start the long process of learning how to use it. The frozen lunch had been a declaration of war, but wars weren't won in single battles. They were won through strategy, preparation, and the gradual building of power. Madison pulled Elena's quilt up to her chin and made her decision. She will go to the workshop on Saturday. She would start training harder, and she would begin the process of becoming someone who could protect what mattered to her. The shy girl who had let her lunch be destroyed was still part of who she was. But she was no longer the only part. The retaliation began on Wednesday morning before Madison even reached her locker. She found a printout taped to the metal door. A crude photocopy of what looked like a deportation notice, with her name scrawled across the top in red marker. Below it, someone had drawn stick figures of people being loaded onto a bus with the words, "Send them back," written in the same angry red ink. Madison's hands shook as she tore the paper down, looking around to see if anyone was watching. The hallway buzzed with its usual pre-first period chaos, but she caught several students glancing in her direction with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. Jamie Chun appeared at her side, having witnessed the entire scene. "Madison, who did this?" "I don't know," Madison lied, crumpling the paper and shoving it into her backpack. She knew exactly who was responsible, but saying Jessica's name out loud felt like admitting defeat. "This is harassment," Jamie said, her voice rising with indignation. "You should report it." But Madison was already walking away, her head down and shoulders hunched. The brief moment of strength she'd felt in the cafeteria yesterday seemed like a distant memory. In the harsh fluorescent light of the morning hallway, surrounded by the chatter and laughter of students who belonged in ways she apparently didn't, Madison felt smaller than ever. The day continued its downward spiral during second period English class. Mrs. Patterson had assigned a group project on American immigration stories, and when it came time to form teams, Madison found herself deliberately excluded from every group. Students who had never paid attention to her before suddenly became very interested in their notebooks whenever she approached. Finally, Mrs. Patterson noticed Madison standing alone by the windows. "Madison, you can join Jessica's group. They only have 3 members. The suggestion hit Madison like a physical blow. Jessica looked up from her discussion with Ashley and Brittany, her face arranging itself into a mask of false sympathy. "Of course," Jessica said sweetly. "Madison can definitely join us. I'm sure she has lots of Personal experience with immigration stories. The comment wasn't quite cruel enough to be obviously inappropriate, but the tone carried enough venom that nearby students exchanged knowing glances. Madison felt heat rise to her cheeks as she realized that Jessica had found a way to continue the harassment under the guise of academic cooperation. "Actually," Madison said, surprising herself with her clear voice, "I'll work alone." Mrs. Patterson frowned. "Madison, the assignment specifically requires group collaboration." "Then I'll find a different group," Madison interrupted, the words coming out sharper than she'd intended. She turned and walked to where Jamie was working with two other students she didn't know well, David Thompson and Alicia Rodriguez. "Can I join you?" Madison asked quietly. Jamie looked up with relief. "Absolutely. We're doing stories from the Cuban immigration experience. Alicia's grandmother came over during the Cuban Missile Crisis." Alicia, a petite senior with paint-stained fingers and kind eyes, nodded enthusiastically. "We could use another perspective. What's your family's story?" For the first time all day, Madison felt like she could breathe properly. "My grandmother came from Brazil when she was 18. She worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school." David, a quiet boy with thick glasses and a gentle demeanor, leaned forward with interest. "That's amazing. How did she end up in Iowa?" As Madison began telling Elena's story, the real story, not the cruel caricature Jessica had created, she felt something loosening in her chest. These students weren't looking at her with pity or mockery. They were listening with genuine curiosity and respect. "Your grandmother sounds incredible," Alicia said when Madison finished describing Elena's journey to citizenship. "I'd love to interview her if she'd be willing." The kindness in Alicia's voice nearly brought tears to Madison's eyes. After 2 days of feeling like an outsider in her own school, the simple act of being included felt revolutionary. But Jessica wasn't finished. During lunch, Madison arrived at table 14 to find it already occupied by 3 football players she'd never spoken to before. When she approached with her lunch tray, they looked up with expressions of exaggerated confusion. "Sorry," said Tyler Brooks, the quarterback who usually ignored Madison's existence entirely. "This table's taken." Madison looked around the cafeteria. Every other table was either full or occupied by students who wouldn't welcome her presence. She could see Jessica watching from across the room, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. "It's fine," Madison said quietly, turning toward the exit. She would eat in the library or the nurse's office or outside in the December cold if necessary. "Madison!" Jamie's voice cut across the cafeteria noise. "Over here." Jamie was sitting with Alicia and David at a table near the windows, and they'd saved an empty chair with Jamie's backpack. The gesture was small, but it felt enormous to Madison as she made her way over. "Thanks," Madison said, settling into the chair. "Those guys are jerks," David said matter-of-factly, adjusting his glasses. "Tyler Brooks asked me to do his chemistry homework last week, then pretended he didn't know me when his friends were around. It's getting worse, isn't it?" Alicia asked gently, looking at Madison with concern. "The harassment?" Madison nodded, not trusting her voice. The kindness in Alicia's question made her feel vulnerable in a way that Jessica's cruelty hadn't. "My older sister went through something similar her junior year," Alicia continued. "A group of girls decided she was too weird because she preferred painting to shopping. They made her life miserable for months." "What did she do?" Madison asked. "She got stronger. Not physically, though. She did take self-defense classes. But mentally, she stopped caring what they thought about her and started caring more about what she thought about herself." That afternoon, Madison walked to the community center with Alicia's words echoing in her mind. The December air was crisp and clear, and the familiar route gave her time to think. Something was shifting inside her, like tectonic plates readjusting. After an earthquake, she arrived early again, finding Master Roberto adjusting the sound system in the corner of the practice space. Brazilian music filled the room, not the traditional capoeira songs, but something more contemporary, with layers of drums and strings that seemed to pulse with life. "How was school today?" Master Roberto asked without looking up from the speakers. Madison had learned that Master Roberto had an uncanny ability to sense when his students were struggling. "Difficult," she admitted. "Good," he said, which wasn't the response she'd expected. "Good." Master Roberto finally looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "Diamonds are formed under pressure, Madison. If school was easy for you, you wouldn't be developing the strength you'll need for the rest of your life." He gestured for her to join him in the center of the room. "Tell me about your weekend workshop decision." Madison had almost forgotten about the Saturday capoeira gathering at the university. "I'm not sure I should go. I'm not good enough yet." "Skill and readiness are not the same thing," Master Roberto said. "You may not have the technical ability of a student who's been training for 10 years, but you have something else. You have hunger." He began the slow, methodical movements of a jinga, and Madison instinctively joined him. Their movements synchronized without discussion, creating a silent conversation that felt more honest than words. "What kind of hunger?" Madison asked as they moved. "The hunger to become who you're meant to be. I see it in the way you've been training these past few days. More focused, more intentional. Like you're not just going through the motions anymore." Madison felt the truth of his words in her body. The capoeira movements that had once felt foreign and awkward now felt like extensions of her own thoughts. When Master Roberto suddenly dropped into a low sweep, she flowed over it without thinking, her body responding from instinct rather than conscious decision. "Better," Master Roberto said, returning to his jinga. "Much better. You're starting to trust the conversation." As other students began arriving, Madison felt a new kind of anticipation. Miguel Rodriguez entered first, followed by Marcus Williams and Sarah Kim. But tonight, there was also someone new, a college-aged woman with intricate braids and the confident posture of an experienced capoeirista. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Kaisha Johnson," Master Roberto announced. "She's visiting from the university's capoeira group and will be joining us for tonight's class." Kaisha smiled warmly at the circle of students. "I'm excited to train with you all. Roberto tells me you have some promising new talent here." Madison felt a flutter of nerves. Was Master Roberto referring to her? She'd never thought of herself as talented, certainly not promising. The class that followed was unlike any Madison had experienced. Kaisha brought a different energy to the rota, pushing everyone to move faster, think quicker, respond more creatively. When it was Madison's turn to enter the circle across from Kaisha, she felt her heart rate spike with nervousness. But as the berimbau began its hypnotic rhythm and the other instruments joined in, something clicked into place. Madison found herself moving with a fluidity she'd never accessed before. When Kaisha threw a lightning-fast martello kick, Madison ducked under it and countered with her own attack, a race-tierra sweep that forced Kaisha to jump clear. The circle erupted in appreciative calls of "I" and "Volta a Mundo." Madison felt a surge of pride and confidence that she'd never experienced in any academic or social setting. "Excellent," Kaisha said as they continued their game. "You have natural timing. How long have you been training?" 3 years, Madison replied, dodging another kick. "Really? You move like someone with much more experience. Who taught you that combination?" Madison realized that the sequence of movements she'd just executed hadn't come from any specific lesson. They'd emerged from somewhere deeper, from the place where instinct and training met creativity. After class, as Madison was helping stack the mats, Kaisha approached her with a serious expression. "Roberto mentioned you're considering the workshop this weekend," Kaisha said. "I think you should definitely come. In fact, I'd like to partner with you for one of the demonstrations." Madison's eyes widened. "You want me to demonstrate?" In front of everyone? I want you to see yourself the way others see you, Kaisha replied. Sometimes we need outside perspectives to recognize our own growth. Walking home that night, Madison felt lighter than she had in days. The harassment at school continued to weigh on her, but it no longer felt insurmountable. She was beginning to understand that Jessica's attacks came from a place of insecurity and fear of anyone who was different, anyone who might challenge. The narrow definition of acceptability that kept Jessica feeling safe, but Madison was no longer interested in making Jessica feel safe. She was interested in making herself strong. That evening, Elena was waiting with hot chocolate and fresh pio de acacar when Madison climbed the stairs to their apartment. The sweet bread was still warm from the oven, and the smell filled their small kitchen with comfort. You look different tonight, Elena observed as Madison settled at the kitchen table. Lighter. Madison considered telling her grandmother about the workshop, about Kaisha's invitation, about the growing sense that she was becoming someone new. Instead, she reached across the table and took Elena's flour-dusted hand in her own. Tell me more about Grandpa, Madison said, about how he fought. Elena's eyes brightened with surprise and memory. Ah, Mia. He was like water and fire at the same time. Fluid when he needed to be, fierce when the moment called for it. He used to say that the strongest fighters were the ones who could choose their battles. How do you choose? Madison asked. Elena squeezed her granddaughter's hand. You choose the battles that matter. The ones that protect what you love. The ones that help you become who you're meant to be. That night, Madison made two decisions. First, she would attend the Saturday workshop and accept Kaisha's invitation to demonstrate. Second, she would stop hiding from Jessica's harassment and start responding to it strategically. The shy girl who had let her lunch be destroyed was still part of who she was, but she was no longer the dominant part. Something stronger was emerging. Something that had been building in secret through years of capoeira training and Elena's wisdom and the gradual accumulation of small moments of courage. Madison Turner was still quiet, still thoughtful, still more comfortable with books than crowds. But she was also discovering that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud aggression, that thoughtful responses could be more effective than impulsive reactions. The real fight was just beginning. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of bitter Iowa wind that cut through even the heaviest winter coats. Madison stood outside the University of Iowa's Recreation Center, watching capoeiristas from different schools stream through the glass doors. Students carried instrument cases and gym bags, their conversations mixing Portuguese, Spanish and English in the musical cadence that always surrounded capoeira gatherings. Elena had insisted on driving Madison to the workshop, despite having to wake up 3 hours early before her weekend shift at the hospital. Now she sat in their old Honda Civic, engine running to keep the heater going, studying her granddaughter's face through the passenger window. You sure about this, Mia? Elena called out. Madison nodded, though her stomach churned with nerves. Through the recreation center's windows, she could see circles of students warming up, their movements flowing with the confidence of years of training. What was she doing here among these experienced practitioners? Remember what your grandfather used to say, Elena added, rolling down her window slightly. The ocean doesn't apologize for its waves. Inside the recreation center, Madison found herself in a gymnasium that had been transformed into a capoeira paradise. 3 separate roads had been marked out on the wooden floor, and the walls echoed with the sounds of berimbau being tuned, and students practicing their movements. The energy was infectious, a mixture of competition, celebration, and pure joy in movement. Master Roberto appeared at her side, carrying his instrument case and wearing the traditional white uniform that Madison had only seen him use for special occasions. Nervous? He asked, noticing her wide eyes. Terrified, Madison admitted. Good. Fear keeps you alert. Overconfidence makes you sloppy. He gestured toward a group of students stretching near the far wall. "Kaisha is over there with the university group. Why don't you go introduce yourself to some of the other participants?" Madison made her way across the gym, passing clusters of capoeiristas engaged in animated discussions about technique and music. She caught fragments of conversation in multiple languages and felt both intimidated and exhilarated by the international nature of the gathering. Kaisha spotted her approaching and waved her over to join a circle of university students who looked impossibly skilled and confident. "Everyone, this is Madison, the student I told you about," Kaisha announced. "She's going to demonstrate with me during the intermediate workshop." A tall, young man with intricate tattoos covering his arms extended his hand. "I'm Carlos Santos, president of the university group. Kaisha says you have some serious natural ability." Madison shook his hand, surprised by the genuine warmth in his greeting. "I'm still learning." "We're all still learning," said a petite woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. "I'm Professor Maria Delgado from the Brazilian Studies Department. I've been practicing capoeira for 20 years, and I discover something new every time I step into the road." The group welcomed Madison with an ease that she'd never experienced at Riverside High. Here, no one questioned her right to belong or made jokes about her heritage. Instead, they asked about her training, shared stories about their own journeys with capoeira, and offered advice about performing in front of large groups. "The key," Carlos explained as they began warming up, "is to remember that everyone in the audience is rooting for you. We're all part of the same community." The morning workshops covered advanced techniques that pushed Madison beyond anything she'd attempted before. She worked on aerial movements with a visiting instructor from New York, learned complex rhythm patterns on the atabaque with a master musician from Salvador, and practiced improvisation techniques that forced her to trust her instincts rather than relying on memorized sequences. During the lunch break, Madison found herself sitting with students from 5 different states, sharing stories about their local capoeira communities and the challenges of maintaining their practice while in school. For the first time in months, she forgot completely about Jessica Martinez and Riverside High. Here, surrounded by people who understood the language of movement and music that had become central to her identity, she felt like she could breathe fully. "You know," said a graduate student named Tomas who had driven down from Minneapolis, "capoeira saved my life in high school. I was getting picked on constantly, felt like I didn't fit in anywhere. Then I found capoeira, and suddenly, I had this whole community of people who accepted me exactly as I was." Madison looked up from her sandwich with surprise. "Really? Really? And not just because I could suddenly defend myself, though that didn't hurt. It was more that capoeira taught me how to move through the world with confidence, how to take up space without apologizing for it." The afternoon workshops focused on the philosophical aspects of capoeira, exploring its history as a form of resistance and cultural preservation. Professor Delgado led a discussion about how enslaved Africans in Brazil had used capoeira not just as physical training, but as a way to maintain their dignity and humanity in the face of systematic oppression. "Capoeira teaches us that survival itself can be an act of rebellion," Professor Delgado explained to the gathered students. "When you move with pride in your heritage, when you refuse to be ashamed of who you are, when you claim your right to exist fully in the world, that is revolutionary." Madison felt something shifting inside her chest as she listened. The parallel between the historical struggles that had given birth to capoeira and her own current situation at school became impossible to ignore. Jessica's harassment wasn't just personal cruelty. It was part of a much larger pattern of trying to make people ashamed of their identities, their families, their cultures. When it came time for the demonstration portion of the workshop, Madison's nerves returned with full force. She and Kaisha would be performing a choreographed sequence that showcased both traditional capoeira movements and modern interpretations, all set to live music provided by the workshop's master musicians. "Remember," Kaisha whispered as they took their positions in the center of the largest rota, "this isn't about being perfect. It's about sharing the joy of capoeira with everyone here." The berimbau began its hypnotic call, joined by the deep pulse of the atabaque and the bright response of the pandero. Madison felt the familiar rhythm enter her body, but something was different this time. Instead of the nervous energy that usually accompanied her performances, she felt a deep calm settling over her dot as the music built. She and Kaisha began their sequence. Madison's movements flowed with a confidence she'd never accessed before, each kick and dodge and sweep executed with precision and grace. When Kaisha launched into an aerial cartwheel, Madison responded with a flowing esquiva that brought appreciative calls from the watching circle. But halfway through their demonstration, something unexpected happened. Madison found herself departing from the choreographed sequence, following an impulse that seemed to come from somewhere beyond conscious thought. Her body began creating new combinations, responding to Kaisha's movements with innovations that surprised even herself. Kaisha, experienced enough to adapt to the change, matched Madison's improvisation with her own creative responses. What had started as a planned demonstration became a genuine capoeira conversation, full of the spontaneity and mutual respect that defined the art form at its highest level. The circle around them erupted in enthusiastic participation, clapping and singing and calling out encouragement as Madison and Kaisha pushed each other to new heights of creativity and skill. Madison felt herself accessing years of training in ways she'd never managed before, her body moving with the fluidity and power that Master Roberto had always insisted was possible. When the music finally wound down and the demonstration ended, the entire gymnasium burst into sustained applause. Madison found herself in the center of the rota, breathing hard and smiling wider than she had in months, surrounded by a community that had just witnessed her transformation from student to artist. "That was incredible," Carlos said, approaching her as the crowd began to disperse. "Where did those combinations come from?" Madison shook her head, still somewhat stunned by what had just happened. "I don't know. They just emerged." Professor Delgado joined their conversation, her eyes bright with excitement. "That's what we call mandinga, the magical moment when technique and instinct and cultural memory all come together. It can't be taught, only discovered." Master Roberto appeared at Madison's side, his usually reserved expression showing unmistakable pride. "How do you feel?" Madison searched for words to describe the sensation of having accessed something powerful and ancient and completely her own. "Like I understand something I didn't understand before. What do you understand?" Madison looked around the gymnasium, at the capoeiristas packing up their instruments and sharing contact information and making plans for future gatherings. She thought about the community that had embraced her without question, the history of resistance and creativity that she was now part of, the strength that had always existed within her waiting to be discovered. "I understand that I belong here," she said finally. "Not just in this room, but in the world. I have a right to take up space." The drive home was quiet, Elena sensing that Madison needed time to process the day's experiences. As they pulled into their neighborhood, past the familiar storefronts and bus stops, Madison felt like she was seeing everything through new eyes. "How was it, Mia?" Elena asked as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. Madison turned to look at her grandmother, this woman who had crossed an ocean to build a better life, who worked 2 jobs without complaint, who had instilled strength and pride even when Madison had been too young to recognize it. "I think I know what Grandpa meant now," Madison said. "About being like water and fire." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her tired face. "Tell me." "Water flows around obstacles, but it also carves canyons given enough time. Fire can be gentle like a candle, or it can consume everything in its path when it needs to. "And which are you?" Madison thought about Jessica's harassment, about the frozen lunch and the fake deportation notice, and all the small cruelties designed to make her feel small and ashamed. She thought about the power she'd discovered in the university gymnasium, the community that had celebrated her strength, the ancestral wisdom that flowed through capoeira movements. "Both," Madison said with quiet certainty. "I'm both." That night, as Madison lay in bed reflecting on the day, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. The shy girl who had let her lunch be destroyed was still part of who she was, but she was no longer the only part. The capoeirista who had improvised with confidence in front of 100 people, who had accessed Mandinga and found her voice in movement, that person was equally real, equally valid. Monday would bring new challenges. Jessica's harassment wouldn't magically disappear just because Madison had discovered her strength. But for the first time since the bullying began, Madison felt ready to meet those challenges from a place of power rather than fear. She was no longer hiding her strength or apologizing for her existence. The ocean didn't apologize for its waves, and Madison Turner was done apologizing for taking up space in the world. Monday morning arrived with crystalline clarity. Madison walked through the halls of Riverside High with a different posture, her spine straight and her eyes forward. Students who had grown accustomed to seeing her hunched shoulders and downcast gaze did double takes as she passed, sensing something had fundamentally changed without being able to identify exactly what. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Madison no longer hugged the walls or apologized when someone bumped into her. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered an unshakable truth about her own worth. Jamie noticed immediately when Madison joined her at their lockers before the first period. "You look different," Jamie observed, studying her friend's face. "Did something happen this weekend?" Madison smiled, remembering the feeling of Mandinga flowing through her movements, the sound of 100 capoeiristas celebrating her improvisation. "I remembered who I am." The morning passed without incident, but Madison could feel the tension building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Jessica and her followers were watching her, waiting for the right moment to reassert their dominance. The weekend's confidence boost would fade, they assumed, and Madison would return to being the invisible target they had grown accustomed to tormenting. The confrontation came during lunch period, but not in the way anyone expected. Madison arrived at the cafeteria to find table 14 conspicuously empty, no football players occupying it, no bag-saving seats for others. She approached cautiously, her newly acquired confidence tempered by suspicion. In her experience, when things seemed too easy, they usually were. She had just settled into her usual seat and begun arranging her lunch when she heard the whispers start. Students at nearby tables were pointing and staring, their expressions ranging from anticipation to concern. Madison looked up to see Jessica Martinez approaching with Ashley and Brittany flanking her. But this time they weren't alone. Behind them walked Tyler Brooks and 3 other football players, their expressions set in the kind of cruel determination that suggested this confrontation had been planned in advance. Other students began gravitating toward the scene, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Well, Jessica announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet section of the cafeteria. "Look who's back in her little corner," pretending like nothing happened last week. Madison remained seated, her hands steady as she unwrapped Elena's carefully prepared lunch. Today, it was pio de acacar with fresh fruit and a thermos of Elena's special Brazilian coffee foods that carried the love and pride of her heritage. "I'm not pretending anything," Madison said calmly, looking directly at Jessica for the first time since their initial confrontation. "I'm eating lunch." The directness of Madison's gaze clearly unsettled Jessica, who had grown accustomed to Madison's averted eyes and whispered responses. But Jessica had brought reinforcements for a reason, and she wasn't about to back down now. "Eating your weird immigrant food," Ashley chimed in, emboldened by the presence of the football players. Don't you have any shame? Madison felt the familiar spark of anger at the cultural mockery, but this time it didn't make her want to disappear. Instead, it crystallized into something harder and more focused. Shame about what? Madison asked, her voice carrying clearly across the watching crowd. About my grandmother working 3 jobs to build a life in this country. About food made with recipes passed down through generations. About being bilingual and bicultural. The questions hung in the air like challenges, each one delivered with increasing strength. Madison stood up slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. Students who had been eating and chatting moments before now watched in complete silence. You want to know what's shameful? Madison continued, stepping out from behind the table. Shameful is bullying someone because they're different. Shameful is being so insecure about your own identity that you have to tear down others to feel good about yourself. Jessica's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. She had expected Madison to cower or cry or run away, not to deliver. A calm, articulate dismantling of her behavior in front of half the cafeteria. Who do you think you are? Jessica sputtered. You're nobody. You're nothing. Your whole family is probably here illegally anyway. The accusation was the same one Jessica had hurled before, but this time Madison didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward, and something in her movement made Jessica instinctively step back. My family has been contributing to this community longer than you've been alive, Madison said, her voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow commanding the attention of everyone present. My grandmother pays taxes, volunteers at the church, and works harder in a week than you've worked in your entire life. Tyler Brooks, apparently deciding that the verbal confrontation wasn't going according to plan, stepped forward with his characteristic swagger. Listen, girl, he said, using the dismissive tone he usually reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. You need to learn your place around here. Jessica's trying to help you understand how things work. Madison turned her attention to Tyler, and something in her expression made him pause mid-gesture. Students who knew Madison only as the quiet girl who never spoke up were seeing someone entirely different, someone who moved with the controlled grace of a trained fighter. And what place is that, exactly? Madison asked Tyler. The place where I hide who I am to make insecure people feel better? The place where I pretend my culture is something to be ashamed of? The place where I let bullies destroy food my grandmother made with love? The reference to the frozen lunch incident made several students murmur with recognition. The story had spread through the school's gossip network, but hearing Madison address it directly gave it new weight. I'm done with that place, Madison continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm done making myself small so that small people can feel big. Jessica, realizing that the confrontation was spiraling away from her control, decided to escalate to physical intimidation. She stepped forward aggressively, invading Madison's personal space in a way designed to trigger fight-or-flight responses. You think you're so tough now? Jessica hissed, close enough that only Madison could hear. Let's see how tough you are when everyone finds out what a freak you really are. But Madison didn't retreat. Instead, she shifted into a subtle Jenga stance, her weight balanced perfectly between her feet, her body ready to move in any direction. The movement was so natural, so much a part of who she had become, that she executed it without conscious thought. The change was immediately visible to anyone who knew how to look. Madison's entire bearing transformed from defensive to ready, from victim to someone who could handle whatever came next. Tyler, recognizing the shift but not understanding its significance, made the mistake of reaching out to grab Madison's shoulder, whether to intimidate her or to physically move her away from Jessica. It didn't matter. What happened next unfolded in less than 3 seconds, but it felt like slow motion to everyone watching. As Tyler's hand approached her shoulder, Madison executed a perfect lateral, flowing smoothly to the side while sweeping Tyler's supporting leg with a race tiara that sent him tumbling to the cafeteria floor. The movement was so fluid, so precise, that it looked almost like dancing until Tyler hit the ground with a resounding crash that echoed through the silent cafeteria. Madison immediately returned to her balanced stance, ready for whatever came next, but Tyler stayed down, staring up at her with a mixture of shock and grudging respect. "Holy shit," someone whispered from the watching crowd, and the phrase seemed to capture what everyone was thinking. Jessica, Ashley, and Brittany stood frozen, their carefully planned intimidation having backfired spectacularly. They had expected to humiliate Madison in front of the entire cafeteria, but instead they found themselves facing someone who had just demonstrated that she was far from defenseless. "Does anyone else want to grab me without permission?" Madison asked calmly, looking around at the circle of students who had gathered to watch. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Principal Morrison's voice cut through the tension. "What is going on here?" Dr. Morrison demanded, striding into the circle with the authority of someone accustomed to breaking up teenage drama. Madison turned to face the principal, her posture relaxed but alert. "Tyler Brooks grabbed me without my consent. I removed his hand." The simple statement, delivered with complete calm, somehow carried more weight than any dramatic declaration could have managed. Around the circle, students nodded in confirmation of Madison's version of events. Dr. Morrison looked down at Tyler, who was still sitting on the floor looking dazed, then back at Madison. "Are you injured, Mr. Brooks?" Tyler shook his head, apparently more embarrassed than hurt. "I'm fine," he mumbled, accepting help from one of his teammates. "Ms. Martinez, Ms. Peterson, Ms. Johnson," Dr. Morrison continued, turning her attention to Jessica's group. "I believe we need to have a conversation about appropriate cafeteria behavior. My office now." As Jessica and her followers were led away, shooting venomous looks back at Madison, the crowd of watching students began to disperse. But the energy in the cafeteria had completely shifted. Students who had ignored Madison for years now looked at her with new interest and respect. Jamie appeared at Madison's side, her eyes bright with excitement and pride. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to move like that?" Madison smiled, feeling the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to fade into a deep sense of satisfaction. "Capoeira. It's a Brazilian martial art my grandmother insisted I learn." David Thompson and Alicia Rodriguez approached from across the cafeteria, their expressions mixing admiration with concern. "Are you okay?" Alicia asked. That looked intense. "I'm fine," Madison replied, and for the first time in months, she truly meant it. "Actually, I'm better than fine." As Madison returned to her lunch, she noticed that the food Elena had prepared remained undisturbed throughout the entire confrontation. No one had tried to destroy it, mock it, or use it as a weapon against her heritage. The pio de acacar was still warm, the fruit was still fresh, and the coffee still carried the comforting aroma of home. She took a bite of the sweet bread, savoring both the taste and the victory it represented. This wasn't just food anymore, it was a symbol of her refusal to be ashamed of who she was, where she came from, or what she valued. Students continued to glance in her direction throughout the remainder of lunch period, but the quality of their attention had changed. Instead of the mixture of pity and curiosity she had grown accustomed to, she now sensed something closer to respect. Madison Turner had spent years being invisible, but she was invisible no longer. She had found her voice, claimed her space, and demonstrated that quiet strength could be more powerful than loud aggression. The shy girl who had let her lunch be destroyed was still part of who she was, but she was no longer the dominant part. The capoeirista who had accessed Mandinga, who moved with the grace and power of her ancestors, who refused to be diminished, that person was equally real, equally present. And Tyler Brooks, nursing his bruised pride as much as his bruised tailbone, would think twice before grabbing anyone without permission ever again. 3 weeks after the cafeteria incident, Riverside High School felt like a completely different place for Madison Turner. The transformation wasn't just in how others saw her, though that had changed dramatically, but in how she moved through the world with a confidence that seemed to radiate from her core. The immediate aftermath of her confrontation with Jessica and Tyler had been intense. Principal Morrison had conducted thorough interviews with witnesses, reviewed security footage, and ultimately concluded that Madison had acted in legitimate self-defense. Jessica's group had received 3 days of in-school suspension for harassment and creating a hostile environment, while Tyler faced additional consequences for unwanted physical contact. But the real changes went deeper than disciplinary actions. Madison discovered that her quiet revolution had inspired other students to find their own voices. David Thompson, who had been verbally bullied for his thick glasses and academic achievements, began sitting straighter in class and contributing more confidently to discussions. Alicia Rodriguez started a cultural awareness club that celebrated the diverse backgrounds represented at Riverside High. Even some of the athletes began questioning the casual cruelty that had previously passed for normal social interaction. The cafeteria incident had become legend, but not in the way Jessica had intended. Instead of being remembered as the day Madison Turner was humiliated, it became known as the day quiet strength proved more powerful than loud aggression. Students began approaching Madison with their own stories of bullying, seeking advice or simply wanting to connect with someone who understood what it felt like to be different. "You've become like a folk hero," Jamie told Madison one afternoon as they walked home from school together. "Half the sophomore class wants to take capoeira lessons now." Madison laughed, adjusting her backpack as they navigated the familiar streets of their neighborhood. "Master Roberto is going to need a bigger practice space." Indeed, enrollment at the community center capoeira classes had doubled since word spread about Madison's background in the Brazilian martial art. Students who had never heard of capoeira before the cafeteria incident were now showing up on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, eager to learn the graceful fighting style that had enabled someone like Madison to handle herself with such composure. Master Roberto welcomed the new students with his characteristic patience, but he made sure they understood that capoeira was about much more than fighting techniques. "Capoeira is conversation," he reminded the expanded circle during a particularly crowded Thursday evening class. "It teaches us to respond to challenges with creativity rather than just force. It connects us to a history of people who found strength in the face of oppression." Madison had become his unofficial assistant instructor, helping newer students with basic movements and sharing the philosophical principles that had transformed her own relationship with conflict. She discovered that teaching others helped deepen her own understanding of the art form. "When I first started," Madison told a group of nervous newcomers during their warm-up, "I thought capoeira was just about learning to fight. But it's really about learning to exist in the world without apologizing for taking up space." One of the new students, a freshman named Sophie Chun, Jamie's younger sister, raised her hand tentatively. "Is it hard to learn?" Madison smiled, remembering her own first days in the community center, when every movement felt foreign and every song was incomprehensible. "The movements take time to master, but the most important lesson happens pretty quickly. You learn that you're stronger than you think you are." The ripple effects extended beyond the capoeira classes. Elena had noticed the change in her granddaughter immediately, commenting on how Madison carried herself with new purpose and spoke about school with engagement rather than dread. "You remind me more of your grandfather every day," Elena told Madison one evening as they prepared dinner together. "Not just in how you move, but in how you see yourself in the world." Madison looked up from the vegetables she was chopping for their stir-fry. "Tell me more about how he handled conflicts." Elena smiled, her hands never pausing in their work as she seasoned the rice. "He used to say that the goal was never to destroy your opponent, but to help them understand their own limitations. When someone challenged him, he would respond with just enough force to end the conflict, but never more than necessary. Is that what I did with Tyler? Exactly. You could have hurt him badly, but you chose to simply remove the threat. That's wisdom, Mia. That's real strength. The academic benefits of Madison's transformation were equally remarkable. Teachers who had struggled to get her to participate in class discussions now found her volunteering thoughtful responses and even challenging ideas when she disagreed. Her English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, pulled her aside after a particularly insightful analysis of a Gabriel Garcia Marquez story. "Madison, I've been teaching for 15 years, and I rarely see such a dramatic positive change in a student's classroom presence," Mrs. Patterson said. "Whatever's happened this semester, keep doing it." Madison's group project on immigration stories with Jamie, David, and Alicia had evolved into something extraordinary. They had interviewed Elena extensively about her journey from Brazil, documented the experiences of Alicia's Cuban grandmother, and researched David's family's migration from Eastern Europe 3 generations earlier. The presentation they delivered to their class was so compelling that Mrs. Patterson arranged for them to share it with other English classes and eventually with the entire school during a special assembly, standing in front of 400 students. In the Riverside High Auditorium, Madison felt none of the paralyzing anxiety that had once accompanied any form of public speaking. Instead, she drew on the same centered confidence that allowed her to step into a capoeira rota without fear. Immigration isn't just about policy or politics, Madison told the assembled students, her voice carrying clearly through the sound. System. It's about people who left everything familiar to build something better for their families. It's about the courage to start over in a place where you don't speak the language, don't understand the customs, and don't have any guarantee of success. She spoke about Elena's journey, about the 3 jobs and night school, and the determination to give Madison opportunities that hadn't existed in rural Brazil. She talked about the foods that carried cultural memory, the languages that connected families across continents, and the strength that came from honoring rather than hiding your heritage. The audience listened with the kind of focused attention that teachers dream about achieving. Students who had never considered the complexity of immigrant experiences found themselves thinking about their own family stories differently. Several came up to Madison after the presentation to share their own backgrounds and express gratitude for making them feel less alone in their differences. Jessica Martinez had been in the audience that day, sitting in the back row with Ashley and Brittany. Madison noticed them leaving before the presentation ended, but their early departure didn't diminish her sense of accomplishment. She had learned that her purpose wasn't to change people who were determined to remain narrow-minded, but to support those who were ready to grow. The most significant change, however, was in Madison's relationship with herself, the girl who had once apologized for existing, now moved through the world with quiet authority. She chose her battles carefully, responded to challenges with thoughtful strategy, and never again allowed anyone to make her feel ashamed of her identity. When a substitute teacher mispronounced her name on her first day, Madison politely corrected him and offered to teach him the proper pronunciation. When a college recruiter visiting the school made dismissive comments about diversity admissions, Madison calmly articulated why diverse perspectives strengthened academic institutions. When a cashier at the grocery store made assumptions about Elena's English proficiency, Madison smoothly intervened with the kind of diplomatic firmness that resolved the situation without escalating it. Each of these moments built on the foundation that had been established in the cafeteria that December day. Madison had learned that standing up for herself and others didn't require aggression or anger. It required presence, clarity, and the unshakable knowledge of her own worth. Spring semester brought new opportunities. Madison was elected to student council, joined the debate team, and started a mentorship program, pairing upperclassmen with younger students who were struggling with bullying or cultural adjustment. The community center asked her to help organize a capoeira demonstration for the local multicultural festival, where she performed alongside Master Roberto for an audience of hundreds. Elena watched from the front row of that demonstration, her eyes bright with pride as Madison moved through complex sequences with the confidence of someone who had truly found her element. After the performance, as families and friends gathered around the capoeiristas to learn more about the art form, Elena approached Master Roberto with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping her find her strength." "Master." Roberto smiled, watching Madison patiently explain capoeira movements to a group of curious children. "I didn't give her strength. I just helped her recognize what was already there." As Madison's senior year approached, college acceptance letters began arriving with regularity. Universities that might have overlooked her earlier academic profile were now eager to recruit a student who had demonstrated leadership, cultural awareness, and the ability to transform challenges into opportunities for growth. But more importantly than any external recognition, Madison had developed an unshakable sense of her own identity. She was Brazilian-American, bilingual, bicultural, and proud of all the complexities that entailed. She was a capoeirista, a student leader, a bridge builder between communities. She was someone who could handle conflict with grace, support others with empathy, and move through the world without apology. On a warm May afternoon, exactly 6 months after the frozen lunch incident, Madison sat at table 14 in the Riverside High cafeteria for the last time as a student. Jamie, David, and Alicia had joined her, along with several newer friends she had made throughout the semester. Her lunch that day was special. Elena had prepared a feast of Brazilian favorites to celebrate Madison's acceptance to the University of Iowa with a full scholarship. The arepas were perfectly seasoned, the fresh fruit was arranged artfully, and the thermos contained Elena's celebratory cafe special. No one tried to freeze it, no one mocked it, no one suggested that it made her less American. Instead, her friends asked curious questions about the ingredients, complimented the presentation, and requested Elena's recipes to try at home. Madison shared the food freely, watching her friends' faces light up as they experienced the flavors that had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. "You know what I love about this story?" Alicia said, taking another bite of the sweet bread. "It's not really about fighting at all. It's about belonging." Madison nodded, looking around the cafeteria where she had once felt so isolated and now felt completely at home. "I think I was fighting for the wrong thing before. I was fighting to be invisible, to not cause trouble, to make other people comfortable. Now I fight for the right to exist authentically." As they finished lunch and prepared for their final afternoon classes, Madison reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The shy girl who had let her lunch be destroyed was still part of who she was. Her thoughtfulness, her empathy, her preference for listening over speaking remained core aspects of her personality. But that girl was now integrated with the capoeirista who could handle conflict with grace, the student leader who could advocate for others, the young woman who moved through the world with quiet confidence and unshakable self-respect. Madison Turner had learned that true strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the most aggressive fighter. True strength was about knowing your worth, honoring your heritage, and refusing to make yourself small to accommodate other people's limitations. And every time she stepped into a ginger stance, every time she shared Elena's cooking with friends, every time she helped another student find their voice, she honored the legacy of everyone who had fought for the right to exist fully and authentically in the world. The ocean didn't apologize for its waves, and neither did Madison Turner. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.